Hi guys, welcome back to a spooky episode of Sin and Tonic. Today's story, as promised, is that of Bible John. Let's go. Sin and Tonic! Oh, I have missed you all very much. I'm so glad to be back up the shed. I do have the beginnings of a cold because it's that time of year. Just for fun, everyone gets a cold about now. So I have cocooned myself in a beautiful hoodie. Well, it's actually one of Paul's. Don't you like wearing other people's hoodies when you're a bit sick? I do. So, don't know, it just feels extra snuggly and comforting. Anyhow, I picked today's story because one of the victims, the final victim, her body was discovered on Halloween. Ooh. Frightful enough to find a body any day, let alone Halloween. So, and the whole story I find eerie and, a bit sort of, it's got a spook to it. I couldn't find anything orangey. I was going to make an orange concoction for today because it's the Halloween vid, but the closest I got to oranga was pink. So we shall go with cheers. Without further ado, let us dive in. We are heading to Glasgow, Scottish. We're going to Scotland. And we are visiting Scotland in the swinging 60s. I was not born. I was not around, but it sounds like it was a lot of fun. Right, I've warmed up a bit. Hood is off. So it would seem from my research that in the 60s, and at the time of our story, especially, so 68, 69, a dance hall was the place to be. It was a rockin'. So yeah, it was like a dance craze. On the 23rd of February, 1968, Patricia Docker would go for a night out. She was a 25-year-old nurse, and she had recently separated from her husband, so she was living with her parents and her child. Like I said, dancing was incredibly popular at this time, and she had arranged on the 23rd of Feb to go for a night dancing, and she ended up at the Barrowland Ballroom. How fancy does that sound? I'll share a picture because it looks quite fancy. It looked like, what's the film? Back to the Future. You know, the ballroom dancing scene and stuff. I think that was in a high school, to be fair, but it reminded me of that and that sort of essence of, fun and frivolity. Patricia had actually started her evening at the Majestic dance hall, but she left there for some unknown reason and she ended up at Barrowland. To be fair, could have thought of a better name because all that comes to my mind is like a land full of wheelbarrows, and it's not that at all, is it? But yeah, anyhow, this I find offensive. I do find this offensive, being over the age of 25, but there was a night on that night, which was the over 25 night, which was referred to as Grab a Granny night. What? So if you're over 25, excuse you, bit much, isn't it? It was possible that Patricia had gone to this night instead, like she'd left the Majestic because she was recently separated from her husband, and this was a night where you would go and you could meet, like she was, I think, did I say she was 25? Yeah, so she was, borderline granny, apparently. So that might have been what swayed her to go to the Barrowland, but that is purely speculation. Patricia did not return home that evening. The next day, Patricia's body was discovered by a neighbour who was on his way to work in like the doorway of a garage entrance. Literally, she was yards away from home. I don't know what do you do yards and stuff in the US? I think so, because of football, isn't that yards? The yard line. Okay, maybe you know yards. So she was really not far from home. She was found completely naked. And whoever finds that person, that body, in that way, they're never going to forget that. They're never going to get that image out of their mind. It's just another level of depravity, isn't it, in cases like this? Depravity? TP. Her handbag was found later on in a river when they dragged the river, and her watch was found quite nearby, near her body. Witnesses had heard some sort of commotion that evening and somebody saying, "Leave me alone," a woman saying, "Leave me alone." Not enough for anybody to sort of jump into action though. Patricia had been beaten and she had been strangled. That was her cause of death. She had also been sexually assaulted and she was also menstruating at the time. Seems grim of me to bring that up, but it is important. We'll come back to that. Sadly, Patricia's case would go cold. 18 months later, on the 15th of August in 1969, 32-year-old Jemima had arranged to go out dancing that evening. She too ended up at the Barrowland Ballroom, dancing the night away. Jemima had 3 children and she was recently separated from her husband. She had left her sister at home with her 3 children to babysit while she went out this night, and Jemima did not return home. It must have been unusual, and her sister, who was at home babysitting, she was worried. On the Monday, after the weekend, her sister heard rumours. She walked past a group of children on the road that her sister lived on, talking about a body in an abandoned building on her sister's street, so where she was, on her road. And it was odd to her, and she went to investigate. And tragically, she then found her sister's body. Jemima's body was naked as well, and she had her shoes and her stockings next to her this time. But again, her handbag was missing. And similarly, she had been beaten and she had been strangled, and that was her cause of death. She had also been menstruating. Witnesses said that they had seen Jemima the night before, or on the night out that she was out on at 12, about midnight, with a tall, slim, dark-haired man. Did I say she was Jemima MacDonald? That was her name. And again, sadly, her case would go cold. But only 2 months later, roughly, on the 30th of October, a woman called Helen Puttock would go out for a night out dancing. Can you guess where? Helen was 29 years old and her husband had been deployed in the army. The reason that has happened is because I'm about to say Germany. Army. So they had been in Germany, come back, and on this particular night, the 30th, she had arranged to go out dancing with her sister. Now, they had done this a few times. Her husband wasn't entirely thrilled about it, and they assured him that they would share a taxi home together. They end up at Barrowland Ballroom. Of course they do. And they meet in the course of the evening 2 men, both named John. They shared a few drinks together, they talked a bit, they danced together, and they ended up sharing a taxi home, the 2 sisters, Helen and Jean, with one of the Johns. And the other John, isn't that a term you use for a client? Prostitutes or sex workers use it for the name of a John. Oh gosh, I don't mean that. So they shared a taxi with John number 1, and John number 2 went home a different way. Jean got out of the taxi first. Her stop was the first stop, and she left Helen, her sister, in the taxi with John. Jean would never see her sister again. The taxi dropped Helen and John off at about 1 a.m. on Helen's road, which was Earl Street. And again, this is just yards away from her house. Helen's body was found the next day, Halloween, by a man walking his dog. I should never have got a dog because it's always dog walkers, isn't it, that find these gruesome things. So sadly, this dog walker found her body. Helen had been... I've just had a thought. Try and remind me of that at the end. Helen had been beaten and she had been strangled with her own tights. And they also found a semen stain on her tights, which they sent off for analysis. But we're talking 1969. It wasn't like it is now. Helen's handbag was missing, but this time the contents had been spread around her body. And she also had a deep bite mark on her leg. This case was slightly different because there were witnesses that had spent time with this guy that Helen had shared a taxi home with, Jean being the main person that had spent her evening with this guy. And it was really important that they find this John because he's like, number one suspect here. This would quickly become one of the biggest cases that Glasgow had ever seen. And the investigation was headed by somebody called John Beattie. I'm just going to put it out there now. I'm going to read from my list the similarities in the three cases, the three murders. Here we are. All three women had spent the nights before their murders dancing at the Barrowland ballroom. 1. They were all brunette. All three had their handbags taken. Boom. All three were wearing a dark black or blue dress. They were all beaten and strangled. 5. They were all menstruating. 6. They were all left yards from their homes. 7. And get this one. Each of the victims had a sanitary towel or tampon left on or near to their body. Likely the one that they had been using that evening. 8. Grim. So that's 8. The only one that I think is a bit okay is the dark blue, black dress. It might have just been the fashion at the time, and that's quite a common dress colour, isn't it? Like navy or black. So not sure. So it's a solid 7. Isn't that like what they say? 7? Is that a dancing thing? I don't watch it, but I've heard of it. The taxi driver that had driven Helen and John and Jean home, he was interviewed. He's key witness. He said that when they arrived at Earl Street, Helen got out of the taxi and John quickly paid taxi man, quickly. And then he sort of darted after Helen. And the taxi man noticed that Helen resisted this John's embrace. So we know that John and Helen are not an item, and also she's right near her home where her husband is. So, but the taxi man did not know all of this information, and he just thought that they were together and that they were possibly like just messing about or having a lover's tiff. That was not the case. Jean was interviewed extensively because she was such an important witness. They even put her under hypnosis. Oh, I fancy that. I'd have a go at that. I think that sounds really also a bit scary though, isn't it? Don't you think? I'd like to do, like that past life thing, right? I think that's interesting. I'd definitely be up for that. But yeah, anyway, so she was put under hypnosis. Jean said that this John had quoted extensively from the Bible in their taxi drive home. So it wasn't long before the press got hold of a lot of this information, and hence Bible John was born. She gave quite a clear description, and there's a very famous sketch that was made, and it's been added to, and they've done this thing where they've like created it in a more realistic way. I'll share some pictures of what he would look like in more like real life rather than this sketch. And they've also then aged that photo. Fascinating. Love that. Jean said that he had one of his front teeth crossed over the other one. He was about 5'10". And when she described him and she did the sketch process, when the sketch was finished, she was genuinely very shocked and amazed at how accurate the sketch was. So she was really impressed, and she was like, that is him. They even took Jean back to Barrowland because they wondered, Barrowland, it just sounds, honestly, all I think about is loads of wheelbarrows. They took her back to the ballroom. I'm going to just have to call it that because the image of all these, like Barrowland, I might have to open a Barrowland, Oh my God. Madge. They took her back there on numerous occasions with undercover police officers and things like that, in the hope that Bible John would return for another victim because, there's 3 women now that have spent their evenings before their murders at this place, and they were like, we think he's going to come back, but that didn't lead to anything. Questions were thrown up about how reliable Jean's witness statement was because, well, let's be real, she was pissed. She was just drunk. So, people were like, how can you rely so heavily? And the reason that this was a thing as well is that John Beattie, the guy that was heading the investigation, he put so much stock into Jean's sketch. He was adamant that this guy, that is what he looked like. And he even discounted some suspects because they didn't quite fit her description. And it all feels a bit squiffy because, she was drunk. And why was he placing so much emphasis? There must have been a reason. He was, an investigator, but he seemed very set on this sketch. Jean insisted, for example, that Bible John had red, sandy hair. But the bouncers who were working that night, who, by the way, were probably sober, I would like to think so, they, mind you never know. What was it like in the 60s? Are they all just like, whoa? Even the bouncers don't know, you never know. So, but they were likely more sober than her. They said that the guy that was with them had dark hair and he didn't have red, sandy coloured hair at all. And if she could be wrong on something like that, what else could she be wrong about? One of the bouncers also said that Bible John, had one of his sort of back upper teeth missing. So when he talked and laughed, you could see. So he'd had one of these removed. He didn't so much remember this sort of tooth at the front that crossed over. So there was discrepancy. And however, Beattie he used that sketch religiously, and it did cause some concern. A different detective, however, chose to see past the sketchy sketch, and he just sort of kept his eyes open when they were at the Barrowland ballroom, like with Jean, and he was scouting about, and he saw a gentleman who would come to the Barrowland, and he was always on his own, and it threw up a flag for this detective, mainly because he also was often heard quoting the Bible. He was taken in for questioning, obviously, and when he was at the police station, he escaped. He escaped by jumping out of a freaking window. Now, if that is not massively suspicious, what the hell is? He was called John Edgar, and they caught up with him, and he was then cleared from their investigations. In 2006, when somebody wrote a book about Bible John and they wrote about John Edgar, he wanted to clear his name. He wanted it to be known publicly that he was not Bible John. So he came forward with a DNA sample, and it proved that that was not a match to the semen that was found on Helen Puttock's tights. And so the case went cold. So now we have 3 cold cases. Years later, in 1996, the semen stain on Helen Puttock's tights was able to be properly tested due to advancements in DNA. This led to the body of somebody called John McGuinness being exhumed. He had committed suicide in 1980, and he had been a prime suspect for John Beattie. He had been interviewed several times back in the day. However, his DNA was not a match, and it was discovered that this John McGuinness, he wore dentures. So, the bite mark on Helen, it was no match. I am not sure why this John McGuinness was such a strong suspect for the investigator. I don't know, and I couldn't find much about that in my research, which was annoying. And I do now want to do some further reading on this whole case. It's a bit like, with Jack the Ripper and things like that. I do find them really interesting. But anyhow, The only possible thing that I can think is in the descriptions of Bible John and the guy that was seen with Jemima before her murder, people were describing this person as having a military posture. Military posture. So it seemed to people that this guy was a soldier and John McGuinness was an ex-Scots Guard. And that's the only possible sort of like thing that I could see as a reason why he might be suspected, but that's weak. And there's got to be more to that story. Now, you learn something new every day, because I did not know. I did know of this case, but I didn't know of this fact, that the 3 murders were not treated as a serial killer case. Each murder was a separate investigation. The police never, and even now, it is not a Bible John situation. The police and the investigators treat each of these women's murders as a separate event. They're not seen as a serial killer's work, right? So then I'm thinking, well, what the hell? Like, what is the case then, Bible John case? But really, that was something that the media, they got hold of the story, they put 2 and 2 together, and they gave him the name of Bible John. But they gave him the name of Bible John. If these cases were never investigated as a serial killer, that means that the police believe that there are 3. Well, they did think about them being linked, but they never did that. So they consider it to be 3 separate murders, and therefore 3 separate murderers. Couldn't think of the word. What is it? Perpetrators. Yeah, that blew my mind. And it also blew my mind because why? Why is it not the Bible John case? Okay, call it something else if you wish, but why do they not investigate it as, one case? Because there are those 7 facts. That to me, like, what a coincidence. Unless... I forgot I put a timer on. Did you see my soul leave my body? Oh my God, I that nearly had me. So, Bible John, invented by the press. The police said that they looked at the murders being linked, but there was no hard evidence to suggest that they were. Okay, I've just remembered what I was going to try and remember from earlier. Thank you for reminding me. The timings of the case. So, the first murder was 18 months before Jemima's. And then the next one was quicker, within a couple of months. But it was, this military link. In my head, I'm like, So between, that 18 months, because people questioned, like, why would the killer wait 18 months? 2 things there. First thing is that sometimes when a serial killer kills for the first time, they are sort of like, oh, it's such a weird thing to think, but like they're satiated by the kill. So that's enough for them for quite a long time sometimes. Sometimes not. Sometimes they escalate quickly. But sometimes it is a big chunk of time between their first murder and then the next one. And then they seem to sort of get quicker. They escalate. I like that word. So that could be the case here, could it not? And also, if he is a military man, perhaps he killed Patricia and then he was, assigned somewhere else in 18 months. Yeah, that could be a thing. He could have been anywhere, really, and just been stationed somewhere else and then returned to Glasgow and go on to kill Jemima and Helen. Also, another thought, doesn't bear thinking about, but it's gone in my brain. Helen's husband was in the army and they'd not long come home, back from Germany. Imagine Helen actually knew his wife's killer. Imagine that. Another question that I have is how, and it also could relate to timing, how does John, let's say, I'm just going to imagine that these are linked because in my head there are too many things to be a consequence. What? not consequence, coincidence, a coinky-dink. So how does Bible John know that these women are menstruating? How does he know that? Does he, you don't ask that of a person, do you? Excuse me, are you on your period? What? Does it come up in the conversation? I don't know. I mean, these people are quite manipulative usually and charming. So perhaps he had a way of getting that information out of women. I don't know. I can't think how. It's also thought that he had, it goes without saying really, but issues with women. He was heard to say that women were adulterous and things like that. So it could also be thought that he was possibly recently divorced himself, or that his wife had cheated on him. I don't know. Could be a thing. Interestingly, Barrowland Ballroom was also known as a place where you could take your wedding ring off, if you know what I mean. So, yeah, perfect place for him to target his victims, if that was his thing. Nobody has ever been caught for the 3 murders. Bible John, nothing, nobody. They remain unsolved. But there have been so many ideas and speculations and suspects that have been thrown into the mix. There's been a theory about police officer, and some guy called Paul Harrison wrote a book on it, but I just don't have much faith in that as a theory. Please feel free to have a look or read the book or share with me in the comments if you think there's anything to it. But as I was researching, the more I did, I was like, no, don't think so. The biggest suspect, if you like, was Peter Tobin from our story last week, hence why I decided to cover Bible John this week. So yeah, he was a big old name that was thrown in there. Could it be him? Peter Tobin met his first wife, Margaret, at the Barrowland Ballroom. He would also beat and rape his victims, and he had a thing for women when they were on their period. What the hell is this about? However, he buried his victims. He hid their bodies away. And Bible John displayed his victims' bodies in a gruesome way, like they were naked. Very disrespectful of their bodies. That is so far from burying the body of your victim. I just don't see that. That to me is a big I don't think it's him. Also, typically, Tobin stabbed his victims. Some people say that with age, as he got older, he might have changed his MO from strangling to stabbing, possibly. But why change from having your victims' bodies out on display to burying them? Not sure. Tobin did have a tooth removed from up here. Do you remember the bouncer said he wasn't sure about the crossed teeth at the front, but he did have a tooth missing, and Tobin did also have a tooth missing. So does Paul. It's quite common to have a tooth removed. Now, most people would have, I don't know, what do you call it? You'd have it made look all nice and put a fakey one in. But back then, no. So I don't know. I probably know about 10 people that have one of their top teeth removed and not replaced. So, bit of a stretch. And as we discussed last week, Tobin was eliminated as a suspect because he was in police custody for one of the murders, right? And for another one of the murders, his ex-wife, who he brutalised and beat and was awful to, she gave him an alibi for one of the other murders. She has no reason to do that. She, if anything, should have been like the opposite. Oh, yeah, it wasn't with me, but she did say, I don't think this was him because he was with me. So I don't think it was Tobin, and he has been eliminated. But I have massive issues with this semen sample, this DNA sample from her tights. It was kept in a locker for years before they tested it. And apparently, experts say that it's just very degraded. So it's not really reliable. It's not a reliable source of evidence. And if that's the case, how many people have they tested this DNA against? It could be that they've actually tested the DNA of the killer and the sample was just too degraded for it to be any good, in which case it's like, it's useless. And that was mentioned a few times in some things that I read when I was researching, and I just thought, it just feels like that's just a waste of time. Yeah, there just was never really any good evidence. It wouldn't happen now, would it? Because of CCTV everywhere. Oh, in the Barrowland ballroom, we should be like, zoom in, there we go, that's the guy. It's ruined it for lots of people, isn't it? Lots of serial killers, the old CCTV. And so it is an unsolved case, or it is an unsolved 3 cases. They're all unsolved. Helen's sister, Jean, never gave up hope, but sadly she passed away, and like I said, it's unsolved, so she never sought any justice for her sister. And that must have been frustrating for her as well, because she had been drunk and people did throw into question what she was remembering. That must have been really hard and like, oh, yeah, sad, actually. What do you think? Tricky one, isn't it? I just think when I went back and I made my list of the similarities in the cases, I was like, I don't know, man. They're so similar. Like, so similar. And the whole, like, sanitary product thing being left on or near the body, that's like in a film, isn't it? You know, like, what do they call that? Like a signature. It's like, come on. It's like Criminal Minds. It's like, it's kind of all there, isn't it? So yeah, I don't know. I found it quite frustrating, and I think many people do. And I think because of how everything went, yeah, never got solved. I've got like one buttock that has completely died. Oh. So glad to be back. I'm really sorry that I missed you last week. I'm going to share with you what has gone down. So I had my results back, and I am likely, because it's hard to sort of like pinpoint and test apparently, but I'm likely in premature menopause. I am now taking HRT because it looks like I'm in premature menopause. Excuse me, why is this on? I did that last week, I think. Rude. Yeah, it's... I've had to do some research and read books. Highly recommend Davina McCall's Menopausing. Really enjoying it actually as a read, and it makes you feel like I felt a bit lonely about the whole thing actually, because I am a lot younger than I thought I would be when this would happen. So, and thank the Lord that I have my babies, my loves, because that must be really tragic for women that haven't reached that point yet, and then this happens early. So yeah, that's what's been going on, and it does explain so many things. Like, honestly, the brain fog is real. I've struggled even with filming like Sin and Tonic. I normally can just glance at a note and then spiel, and I've been finding that really difficult. And today was much better because of my new, I'm noticing slight improvements already from my gel. I can't remember what it's called, but it's like estrogen. So yeah, trying to bring my hormones back up. Trying to write university assignments when you cannot hold on to a thought has been challenging. So I thought it can't hurt to just give my brain a good rest and then come back fighting, which, I think it's worked. Okay, I'm going to love you and leave you because I haven't had my tea yet and I am hungry. Okay, love you lots. I will be back next week. Is next week my 100th video? I think next week or the week after is Sin and Tonic's 100th video. Give me some suggestions for a big bad boy 100th video. go ahead, share. Yeah, not sure what to do. All the pressure. Yeah, help me out. Okay, I love you all. I missed you, and I will see you all next week. Bye.